Welcome everybody. It's wonderful to welcome you here to Bethel Baptist Church. My name's Johan. I'm part of the leadership team here. And this is Derek, who will be giving us a presentation just a little bit later. Bit of housekeeping information. Fire exit's there. There's another door there if the fire is there. The toilets are there, so don't go to the toilets there if the fire is there. You know, all those sorts of basic things. Don't worry if you need to sort of get up and move about, especially if you're a bit hot. The room can get a bit hot. Just do what you need to do. That's absolutely fine. Just a really quick show of hands. How many of you have heard of Wikipedia? Wikipedia? Any of you heard of Wikipedia? Great. Okay, good. I think anybody who's sort of my age or maybe a little bit above would know about Wikipedia. I wonder whether maybe some of the younger ones are just like, is that ChatGPT but for oldies? It's a bit like that. So, what you'll know, if you know Wikipedia, is that you'll know that it started out as a kind of skeptical, alternative source for facts edited by the community. That's really what it was, online. It was quite radical at the time, wasn't it? It was co-founded by this guy, a man called Larry Sanger. If you study your news, you'll know that Larry Sanger recently said that he has become a Christian after a 35-year journey, which included being an agnostic for a very long time, teaching philosophy at various different universities. And he says, look, I just ran out of reasons not to believe anymore. Isn't that interesting? Isn't that interesting? But of course, tonight it's not really about that. It's more about facts. And facts, Wikipedia facts or otherwise, they don't create faith, of course. And Sanger, what he found most convincing was not really the facts. It was the person of Jesus Christ, which he read about in the Bible. He found that really compelling. And the time that he spent with Christian people. Those were the two things that really kind of got him onto Christian faith. On the other hand, if you just have faith and you have no facts, then your faith is blind, isn't it? And that's what we hear a lot outside of these doors is, oh, if you've got faith, well, it must be blind faith. It must be sort of faith despite the facts. I'm very pleased to welcome Derek McIntyre, who is here to help us with some of those facts. Derek's trained scientist and engineer, and I think I'm right in saying you weren't born into a religious family?
Oh, yes, you're right in saying
I am right in saying
yes,
that.
I
okay.
wasn't born into a religious
You weren't?
family.
No, I wasn't born. Okay, glad we got that one clear. And you were agnostic into your 30s?
Late 30s.
Into your 30s?
Well, actually, I guess 45 I gave my life to Christ, but okay, yeah. Yep.
There you go. There you go. So a long time. And you've been doing this presentation for quite a long time as well.
Yeah, about 15 years.
15 years. Great. Well, I'm going to hand over to you. It'd be great to hear why you do this.
Okay,
and then take it away. Thank you, Derek.
Thank you. Lovely. Okay. Can I have the first slide? Oh, my God. The first slide. Oh, all right. It works. Fantastic. Right, good. So, you'll have seen from the promotional material that this evening is really, we're going to look at the historical and rational basis for Jesus being the Son of God. So, we're going to ask the question, was Jesus' life, death, and resurrection actual historical events? So, I'm going to start by putting two statements up on the screen. There's a historical and rational basis for Jesus being the Son of God, a historical and rational basis, and there's a wealth of evidence to support that view. So the purpose of this evening really is to provide an introduction to that historical and rational evidence and try and draw some conclusion from the evidence presented. Clearly, in one evening, we won't be able to cover these topics in forensic detail. The pile of books you see on my front living room carpet is just a fraction of the books currently available on this topic. So, clearly we're not going to be able to provide we're going to be skipping over certain topics, undoubtedly. And there'll be time at the end to ask questions and perhaps explore some of the topics you might want to talk about in a bit more detail than we can this evening. Also, you'll all get a copy of this booklet before you leave. This booklet goes into everything we're going to cover in far more depth than I can in a couple of 40-minute presentations. So make sure you don't leave without, make sure you take a booklet away with you before you go. So the plan for tonight is what we're going to do is review the sources of evidence for Jesus that are available to us today, and more importantly, we'll ask whether these sources are reliable or not. After that, we're going to have a look at the picture of Jesus that emerges from these sources. After a short break for tea and coffee, we'll spend the rest of the presentation looking at the available evidence for the resurrection. So it's ideal this presentation's on this week. Clearly, we're just coming up to Easter. So obviously very relevant looking at evidence for the resurrection. Each half of the presentation will last about 40 minutes. After the second half, there'll be opportunities, as I said, to ask questions on topics you might want to explore in more detail. Okay, that's what we're going to do. So why am I presenting this evening? Well, I thought it'd be worthwhile just telling you a bit about myself. I'm a Christian, although I used to be an agnostic. I would have regarded myself as a resolute agnostic. I thought about religious matters in my teens, as many people do, but never came to any kind of clear conclusions. I suppose I parked the big questions on God and Jesus in a file in the back of my head with a view to thinking about them later, but never did. So through my 20s and 30s, I guess I had the view of many people in the UK today that I really didn't know what to think about God or Jesus. I suppose I probably thought you needed to have some sort of faith to be a Christian, and frankly, that faith was for other people. People who had been perhaps brought up Christians, or perhaps people who'd experienced some form of life-changing spiritual experience. Neither situation applied to me. However, in my late 30s, I thought it would be worthwhile revisiting some of the questions I'd left unresolved in my teens. My thoughts were there are plenty of capable, intelligent people who profess to have some sort of belief in God. For example, scientists like Albert Einstein and Francis Collins, ex-head of the US Genome Project. Other examples I saw were politicians like Nelson Mandela, military men like Norman Schwarzkopf and Richard Dannett, and so on. I remember seeing a survey in the science magazine Nature in 1997, which said that 4 out of 10 scientists said they believed in God. Okay, just over 45% said they didn't believe, and 14% described themselves as doubters or agnostics. However, a figure of 40% surprised me. Well, why did they believe? Also, if I looked at the religious leaders in this country, they were clearly intelligent men and women. If these people had some sort of belief in God, then perhaps it was worthwhile looking at this again to try and find out why. So at this time, as I was starting to think this way, I happened to meet a colleague when I was on a business trip to the USA, who it turned out happened to be a Christian. He was from California, and I wasn't aware of this. Well, I was aware of he's from California, but because he told me. I wasn't aware if he was a Christian until I asked him where he'd been on holiday that year. He told me he'd been over to Oxford in the UK on missionary work. I didn't think they sent missionaries to Oxford. They are. So now you know. They do from California. So as you can imagine, that sparked my curiosity, of course, as of course it was intended to, and the conversation turned to spiritual matters. The upshot of the conversation was that he'd send me a couple of books that he thought might help with the questions I had. Sure enough, 2 weeks later, I received a package containing a copy of The Case for Christ by Lee Strobel and a Bible. Now, did reading The Case for Christ turn me into a Christian? Well, frankly, no, it didn't. But what it did, though, was act as a starting point for my own investigation into who Jesus is. Frankly, I was amazed at what I found. I was amazed at my own ignorance of the evidence I found. How can I be living in a Christian country and not be aware of this stuff? So the reason I'm presenting this evening is I kind of think it's important to share the information I found with others and allow them to draw their own conclusions. Anyway, enough of me. Let's get into the meat of the presentation. So when you read this booklet we provide at the end of the evening, you'll find that about half of it is devoted to reviewing the sources of evidence we have for Jesus and assessing how reliable these are. For tonight, I've really just provided a very, very brief summary of that. So, what are the sources we've got for Jesus? But before that, I should probably put this up. I like a pointer. I like a pointer. I bought this on Amazon, and I did that, and I put it in this backpack, and I completely forgot about it. I couldn't remember where I put it, and I was rummaging through that backpack about 6 months later, and I found it. I thought, brilliant! I found my pointer, and then I realised this backpack with that bag, this in it, had been through Glasgow Airport Security, Edinburgh Airport Security, Schiphol Airport Security, Heathrow, and Charles de Gaulle. So, if you want to hijack a plane, get one of these. Now, hopefully, there's no airport security people in here. I've been telling that for a number of presentations. I'm thinking, oh hell, hope there's not a security person here. Oh, you get frog marched out of here. Anyway, right. So this is from Wikipedia, and I think we're probably before the fella converted, because I put this in about a year ago. What it says is that the contrary perspective that Jesus was mythical is regarded as a fringe theory. Now, if you're sitting here thinking, well, did he really exist? The majority of today's historians that specialise in this period of history are all agreed that Jesus did exist. And there's a quote from a guy called Bart Ehrman. I don't know if any of you know Bart Ehrman. He's a Jesus scholar, and he's also an agnostic. Whatever else you may think about Jesus, he certainly did exist. So we're taking that as read this evening. And the reason we're taking it as read, the majority of today's historians that specialise in this period of history are all agreed that that is the case. So there's really, I think, no argument that Jesus did actually exist. So, but anyway, so I just wanted to put that to one side. So what are the sources we've got for Jesus? Okay, we've got the 4 Gospels in the Bible. We've got the letters of Paul, Jude, James in the Bible. We've got the Gospels of Jesus that didn't make it into the Bible, often called the Apocryphal Gospels. We've got written sources from outside the Bible dated to shortly after Jesus' life. We've got archaeological evidence, and we've got circumstantial evidence. Now, of these, I think the one that's most often overlooked is the last one, circumstantial evidence. Okay, I'd like to just think about this for a minute. Christianity has existed on this planet for a very long time. Christianity has more followers today than any other religion. However, we know that there was a time when there were no Christians on this planet. So why are there Christians today? Well, logical cause and effect tells us that something must have happened in the past, some cause, that had the effect of compelling some people to become the first Christians. Now, that might sound like stating the obvious, and I suppose it is. But for atheists, agnostics, Christians, those of other faiths, that provides a direct challenge. Cause and effect tells us that the start of Christianity is a historical event. As a result, when and why Christianity started can be studied like any other historical event. Historians of all faiths and no faith have been doing this kind of thing for about 200 years. The key point we mustn't lose sight of is that something happened to cause all the Christianity we see all around us today. Something happened to start it all in the first place, and given all the historical research that's been directed towards finding out what happened, all of us, you, me, can come to our own informed view of what we think happened. So let's have a very brief look at what the sources historians use for their research. Well, let's start with the Gospels. Now, when I was an agnostic, I thought the 4 Gospels in the Bible were theological texts written hundreds of years after the time Jesus was supposed to have lived, and the Gospels we read today were substantially revised and doctored versions of what probably been written in the first place. In other words, I thought they couldn't be used as the basis for historical research on Jesus. I was surprised to find that the general view amongst today's historians that specialise in this period of history is very, very different. The current view is that the Gospel of Mark was written around 60 to 70 AD. That's 30 to 40 years after Jesus died. With the Gospels of Matthew and Luke written about 10 years after Mark, and the Gospel of John written around 90 AD. I was surprised to find there are many thousands of early Gospel manuscripts, some from as early as the 2nd century AD, that exist today. And I was surprised to find out that when those manuscripts are compared using a technique the historians use called textual analysis, it's found that these documents look to be pretty accurate versions of what was originally written. In other words, historians are of the view that the Gospels haven't been substantially altered, either deliberately to fit in with later theology or accidentally as part of the handwritten copying process to produce documents before the invention of printing in the Middle Ages. Okay, so historians can tell us that Gospels are pretty accurate versions of what was originally written. But are the Gospels accurate descriptions of what actually happened? Well, the answer in part comes from the dates the Gospels were written. As I said a minute ago, Mark was written around 30 to 40 years after Jesus died. Now, life expectancy was shorter in those days. However, when the Gospels were written, there'd be a good chance that some of the people who had actually seen and heard Jesus would still be alive. In short, there'd be still first-hand witnesses for Jesus' life available to draw upon for information. And I guess, probably more importantly from our perspective, to challenge what was written down if it was inaccurate. Also, the 30 to 40 year time span doesn't give much time for legends and myths to develop about Jesus. Now, there's a general rule amongst historians that the longer the time period between something happening and it being written about, the greater the chance of legendary material getting into the narrative. The 30 to 40 year time span with Jesus is, in historical terms, very short. For comparison, the earliest biographies we have of Alexander the Great were written more than 400 years after his death, written by Arrian and Plutarch. These are the biographies that we base our knowledge of Alexander the Great upon. So, from a historian's perspective, there's a very good chance that the Gospels are pretty accurate representations of Jesus' life, given they were written very shortly after the actual events being described. Okay, but what about the differences in the Gospels? Now, it's well known there are some apparent differences in the details of the Gospels. For example, the number of people that find Jesus' tomb empty varies between the Gospels. The detail of the birth narrative varies between the Gospels. There isn't a birth narrative at all, of course, in John or Mark. The order of some of the events in Jesus' life varies from Gospel to Gospel. In one Gospel, we find Jesus' mother Mary being told clearly that the child she's about to give birth to is the Son of God. Yet in another Gospel, we're told that Jesus' mother and family tried to stop him in his ministry, saying that he was out of his mind. Odd behaviour if you knew your son was God's son. It's also well known that John's Gospel, that is the one written last, is quite different in the way of it's written, and it's more, in inverted commas, theologically developed than the other three. Does that not reduce the credibility of the information in that Gospel? Well, extensive analysis of Gospels in the last couple of hundred years has led to the consensus view that the Gospels were written at least semi-independently and were drawing upon the oral histories of more than one early Christian community. Well, unsurprisingly then, there'll be slight variations between these oral histories, and that would be reflected in the Gospels. Also, as John's Gospel was written last, once Christianity and Christian theology was more developed, it's unsurprising that is reflected in the content of John's Gospel. But what I think is surprising is that these differences exist in the Bibles we read today. What this clearly tells us is that these awkward passages have been left in, lending evidential weight to the view that the Gospels we read today are accurate versions of what was originally written. Okay, that's a very brief run-through of the Gospels. Another source of evidence we have for Jesus is the letters that the early Christian apostle Paul wrote to various early Christian communities in Rome and other locations in the eastern part of the Roman Empire. Now, these were written 15 to 25 years after Jesus died. So, Paul's letters predate the Gospels. Now, there's a consensus view amongst historians that the majority of the letters of Paul in the Bible were genuinely written, well, I suppose more accurately dictated by Paul himself. Now, that's not to say the other ones weren't written by Paul. It's just there's more debate about whether they were written by Paul or not. In the letters is clear evidence that Christian worship and belief were already well developed. Logic tells us this must have happened earlier than 15 to 25 years after Jesus died. Now, one example is from Paul's letter to the Corinthians. That's 1 Corinthians chapter 15. This is one of the letters historians are confident was actually written by Paul. And it says, "Now, brothers, I want to remind you of the gospel I preached to you, which you've received and which you've taken your stand. By this gospel you're saved if you hold firmly to the word I preached to you. Otherwise, you believed in vain. For what I received, I passed on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, and he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and they appeared to Peter, then to the 12. After that, he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles, and last of all, he appeared to me also, as to one abnormally born." Well, why is that passage important? Sorry, I should have put that up there. So, as I mentioned before, Paul's letter to the Corinthians is regarded by historians as genuine. The passage we've just seen and heard is also regarded by historians as genuine. In other words, it doesn't look like a later addition. And what it shows is that at least as early as 15 to 25 years after Jesus' death, and most likely earlier than that, the central message of Christianity was the death and resurrection of Jesus and what it meant. Okay. Another source of evidence we've got are what are known as the Apocryphal Gospels. Now, there are many other accounts, if you like, Gospels of Jesus' life that aren't in the Bible. Some of these have survived to the present day and are available for both historians and the general public to read and study. Now, you may have heard in the press about 10 years ago, the unearthed Gospel of Judas Iscariot. This is just one of many other Gospels, such as the Gospel of Thomas, the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Pseudo-Matthew, etc. These apocryphal Gospels, as they are known, were either written well into the 2nd century AD or later. They often contain more fanciful accounts and supernatural accounts of Jesus' life, just as historians might expect from that rule of thumb I described a minute ago. That is, the longer the time period between something happening and it being written about, the greater the chance of legendary material getting into the narrative. So historians use these apocryphal Gospels, I guess they're probably more useful for studying the beliefs of the 2nd and 3rd century Christian communities that they sprung from. Okay, another source of evidence is contemporary non-Christian written sources. Now, a reasonable question to ask is, why are there no surviving documents describing Jesus' life from non-Christian writers at the time of Jesus? The argument goes, if the events of Jesus' life were so momentous, why were they not written about by other writers at the time? Well, although we don't ultimately know for definite why that is, we suggest that the likely answer is rather mundane if we consider who might have recorded this. That is, the Jewish, Roman, Greek scribes writing for the Jewish and Roman authorities. From a Jewish and Roman authorities' perspective, Jesus, I think, would have been seen as just another Jewish holy man who had stirred up the Jews in Jerusalem and was quickly dealt with before he could cause any real trouble. These events were occurring in a tiny part of the Roman Empire where this kind of thing happened regularly. I think it would hardly have been worth a mention. Now, what I did, I was interested to find out what was happening in the Roman Empire about the time of Jesus' mission. And these things were all happening in the Roman Empire when Jesus was conducting his mission down in the bottom right-hand corner of the empire. This caused major turmoil throughout the Roman Empire. I don't know if you remember, probably some of you are old enough to remember watching I, Claudius on the television. This was very graphically illustrated. Was Patrick Stewart played Sejanus, the head of the Praetorian Guard. I saw a picture of him. He was challenging his inner Leo Sayer because he had blonde curly hair. You can't believe that now from the point of view of what you see in Star Trek, sorry. Anyway, so Sejanus had actually appointed Pontius Pilate to be governor of Judea, and it was created a whole lot of turmoil throughout the empire. Rome was suppressing Germanic tribes in the north. The Dacians were threatening Rome's border. There was a major financial crisis in Rome. I think you'd agree these items are probably far more important from a Roman perspective than some itinerant Jewish preacher causing a bit of trouble down here. Now, if the Jewish authorities had written about Jesus, it would have had to survive the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70 and AD 135. I won't go into the details of the Jewish uprisings at that time and the Roman response, other than to say the Romans ultimately flattened the city, destroyed the Jewish temple completely, and either killed or scattered the Jewish inhabitants. Not ideal conditions for the survival of documents, particularly, I think, in Jewish eyes, the less important non-sacred documents. Okay, is that it? Well, although there are no reliable early non-Christian documents describing Jesus' life, there are a number of non-Christian documents describing Jesus' early followers. In the booklet, we provide a more extensive list of these documents and what they say. However, tonight there's really just one reference I'd like to focus on. That is Tacitus. In 115 AD, Tacitus, who was a Roman historian, wrote his History of Rome. And in that, he describes how Nero persecuted Christians as scapegoats to divert suspicion away from himself for the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD. Now, what does that admittedly brief mention of Christians tell us? Well, one thing it tells us is that there were sufficient numbers of people who saw themselves as Christians in Rome in 64 AD to come to be the attention of Nero. Now, if you think about this, to be a persecuted minority, there have to be sufficient numbers of that minority to come to the attention of the majority. To use a contemporary example, consider asylum seekers in the UK. There have been people seeking asylum in the UK for hundreds of years. However, they've only begun to be seen as a group called asylum seekers when their numbers grew significantly around the turn of the millennium. So the reference in Tacitus tells us that less than 35 years after Jesus' death, there was a Christian community large enough and vocal enough to be noticed by the emperor and worthy of persecution in Rome. Okay, that's another source of evidence we've got for Jesus. We've also got archaeology. Now, we spend some time looking at archaeology in the booklet. I won't really spend any time on that tonight. Just time doesn't allow it, really. Other than to talk about maybe this picture here. Now, what that is, that's a foot bone that with a nail through it, and that's a reconstruction of the foot and the way the nails through the foot. That was found in a Jewish tomb in Jerusalem. Prior to that being found, historians were of the view that everybody that was crucified was thrown out on the municipal rubbish dump outside Jerusalem, where they were eaten by wild animals and dogs. When that was found, it clearly demonstrates that at least some Jews were given a proper burial after they were crucified. And of course, that ties up with what happened with Jesus. So I think it's fair to say that the archaeology provides a generally supportive picture of the details of the Gospels. But you can read it for yourself in the booklet you'll get at the end of the evening. So that is so these are the sources that historians, you and I, can use to come to some informed conclusions about Jesus. So when examining this evidence, what do today's historians agree upon regarding the life of Jesus? Well, when I was doing my research into who Jesus is, I read a book by the historian Professor E.P. Sanders. That's the book up in the top right-hand corner of the slide. E.P. Sanders is regarded as a leading figure in research on the historical Jesus. This particular book was written in 1993. In the book, Sanders provides a few brief statements about Jesus, which he says, to quote Sanders directly, amongst historians almost beyond dispute. These are: Jesus was born circa 4 BCE, near the time of death of Herod the Great. He spent his childhood and early adult years in Nazareth, a Galilean village. He was baptized by John the Baptist. He called disciples. He taught in the towns, villages, and countryside of Galilee, but apparently not the cities. He preached the kingdom of God. About the year 30, he went to Jerusalem for Passover. He created a disturbance in the temple area. He had a final meal with his disciples. He was arrested and interrogated by Jewish authorities, specifically the high priest. He was executed on the orders of the Roman prefect, Pontius Pilate. Sanders then goes on to provide what he refers to a short list of equally secure facts about the aftermath of Jesus' life. Again, these are historical facts that today's historians are agreed actually happened after his death. These are: the disciples first fled. The disciples saw Jesus, but in what sense is not certain, after his death. As a consequence, they believed he would return to found the kingdom. And they formed a community to await his return and sought to win others to faith in him as God's Messiah. Now, I wonder if any of you here find that list surprising. I know I did when I first read it as an agnostic. I was surprised that the accepted historical view of Jesus' life and its aftermath was so close to being what I understood to be the biblical view. Now, when we look at the evidence for the resurrection later on this evening, I'll come back to this list along with some of the circumstantial threads of evidence regarding early Christianity I've touched on so far. However, before this, I'd like to briefly look at what the sources tell us about Jesus himself. The sources indicate that Jesus' disciples thought he was the Son of God and Messiah. Were they correct then? Okay. Now, for the atheist and agnostic, it's hard to believe that the historical figure of Jesus is also the Son of God. So is Christianity based on some massive misunderstanding of who Jesus was? Well, I'd like to take a few minutes to look at what the sources tell us about who Jesus was and is. Okay, it's sometimes suggested that although Jesus saw himself as a teacher and Jewish holy man, he didn't regard himself as the Son of God. Indeed, some have claimed that as a good Jew, he would have regarded such a view of himself as blasphemous. Now, to address that question, I've picked a couple of examples from Mark's Gospel. You'll remember from earlier on this evening that Mark was the gospel written first, some 30 to 40 years after Jesus died. I've chosen examples from Mark's gospel to reduce the possibility of Christian theology getting in the way of developing an accurate picture of Jesus' view of himself. Now, when we look at Mark's gospel, we can see clear evidence of Jesus thinking and acting in a manner consistent with his believing he is the Son of God. For example, in Mark's gospel, Jesus forgives sins. In the miracle narrative, Jesus sometimes links the physical and mental affliction of the person about to be healed with that person's sinfulness. For example, in Mark chapter 2, he says, "Son, your sins are forgiven," as a precursor to the healing of a paralyzed man. Now, as any good Jew knew, only God can forgive sins. Jesus knew the Jewish scriptures and teachings, and acting in that way, he was directly linking himself with God. In Mark, it says that the Jewish religious authorities also realized that and accused him of blasphemy as a result. In Mark's gospel, Jesus teaches on his own authority. Now, this might appear as a bit of a technicality, but in Judaism, you required two people to conduct religious teaching. One to witness what the other was saying, and vice versa. Jesus, however, makes a point of teaching alone. He precedes many of his teachings with the words, "I tell you the truth." Well, so what, you might say? Well, any other Jewish teacher in the first century would say something like, "I tell you the truth, and here's a teacher standing next to me that'll verify I'm telling the truth." So why is that important? A Jewish audience would know that only God can teach on his own authority. Again, Jesus is directly linking himself with God by teaching in that particular way. In Mark's gospel, he refers to God as Father or Abba. That's Aramaic for dad or daddy. Well, so what, you might say again, isn't God regularly referred to as Father in the Christian church? It doesn't mean that Christians believe that God is their actual biological father. I guess the problem here is that we're used to a Christian view of having an intimate father-child relationship with God, a relationship modeled on Jesus' relationship with God. So as a result, it's been common in the last 2,000 years to refer to God as Father. However, to first century Jews, calling God Father would be blasphemous. Jews weren't even allowed to mention God's name. The tetragram YHWH, often pronounced, if you're allowed to pronounce it, I suppose, Jehovah. So to refer to God as dad or daddy, Abba, would be seen by Jews as downright eccentric as well as blasphemous, unless, of course, you actually were God's son. Now, the miracles sometimes in Mark's gospel had symbolic meaning to those that were performed in front of. They were performed in such a way as to link Jesus to such Jewish figures as Moses, Elijah, Joshua, and so on. Now, another miracle, the calming of the storm, also suggested to those that witnessed it that Jesus was God. In that event, Jesus and his disciples are in an open boat in the Sea of Galilee when they're caught in a violent storm. As the wind and waves rage and the boat begins to fill with water, Jesus is sleeping at the back of the boat on a cushion. The disciples wake him up shouting, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" Jesus gets up, shouts at the waves, "Quiet, be still." At this, the storm immediately abates. Jesus then gives his disciples a hard time for the lack of faith in him. Now, at this time, Jews believed that only God had control of the elements. Further, Jews believed that Satan's home was under the waters of seas and lakes. For Jesus to take control of the wind and waves in this way was a clear sign to his followers that he was God and that he had control over Satan. No wonder the disciples were terrified and asked each other, "Who is this? Even the wind and waves obey him." Now, in summary, I think it's fair to say these points don't provide conclusive proof that Jesus is the Son of God. However, I think it certainly indicates that it was very likely that he thought of himself in that way. Okay, I think you'd agree, if someone thinks they're the Son of God, a member of the general public thinks they're the Son of God, we'd agree they were massively deluded. So was Jesus also severely deluded to think of himself in that way? Well, we look at what psychologists think of Jesus' mental condition when they review the sources of evidence we have for him. And the conclusion they come to, and we come to, is there's no direct evidence or even hints of evidence that Jesus was exhibiting any of the behavior patterns associated with delusional behavior. Okay, so it looks from the sources of evidence that Jesus saw himself as the Son of God and Messiah, and there are no clues to suggest he was massively deluded. However, what if he unintentionally misled the disciples so they believed he was the Son of God? What if he sincerely believed he was the Son of God but was just wrong? Alternatively, what if he deliberately misled the disciples? What if he had some other agenda for saying he was the Son of God? What if the miracles and healings were actually sleight of hand, deceptions and magic tricks and so on? These are all reasonable questions. I'll spend a couple of minutes looking at each one individually. So let's talk about, did Jesus unintentionally mislead his followers? Now, earlier we discussed whether Jesus was severely deluded, mad if you prefer, to think he was the Son of God. My guess is that we're all quite comfortable with concluding that it's unlikely he had serious mental health problems. But what if he'd unintentionally misled his followers? What if he sincerely believed he was the Son of God but was just wrong? Now, that's a common argument put forward by non-Christians. To quote our old friend Richard Dawkins in The God Delusion, page 92 of the hardback version, if you want to check. A fourth possibility, Richard Dawkins writes, a fourth possibility, obvious, almost too obvious to need mentioning, is that Jesus was honestly mistaken that he was the Son of God. Plenty of people are honestly mistaken about all kinds of things. Well, yes, indeed, plenty of people are honestly mistaken about all kinds of things. It doesn't make them mad. I've been honestly mistaken about all kinds of things in my life. However, if I stood up here right now, took off my specs, looked at you in a kind of focused way and said, I'm the Son of God, no, I really am. I know it's a bit unlikely with this accent and this wee shirt and the lack of hair and that, but I am the Son of God. Well, what would you think? I think probably the politest thing you would say to me is I probably need to have a wee sit down and a drink of water. I'm just going to have a drink of water just right now. That's a nice wee break for me. So what am I saying? I'm saying you can't have it both ways. If you think you're God, then you really are wrong in the head, or God. Further, if you think you're God and are prepared to do something about it, that by going on a mission that collects followers and ends up challenging the established religious order and ends up getting you and most of your followers killed, you really are wrong in the head, or God. Okay. So given what I've just said, it's pretty unlikely he unintentionally misled his followers. Well, could he have deliberately misled his followers so they believed he was the Son of God? Well, what if all those miracles were elaborate hoaxes, hypnotism, magic tricks, sleight of hand, so on and so forth? Now, we know of some other messianic and charismatic leaders in the past who have deliberately misled their followers, like these two characters here. Could Jesus have done something similar? Well, we look at that in the booklet, and really we come to the conclusion that really there is no direct evidence or even hints of evidence that Jesus did something like that. He just looks completely unlike somebody that was going to deliberately mislead his followers, if you read the Gospels for yourself. Yeah? Okay, so it looks like he thought he was the Son of God. It looks like he wasn't mad or delusional. It's very unlikely he knowingly or unknowingly misled his followers. So what are we left with? Well, maybe just maybe, he was who he said he was. Now, what I'd like to do now is have a short break. After the break, I'd like to move on to the one key event on which the existence of Christianity rests. That is the death and resurrection of Jesus. Is there compelling evidence to support the resurrection being an actual historical event? Thank you. Go and get a cup of tea. Okay. Good. Right, have we lost anybody? Don't think so. No, it's not bad. Nobody's run away. Good. Well, thank you for staying. And so let's have a look at the resurrection, the evidence. Now, what we're going to do now is we'll go back to that list of secure facts from E.P. Sanders' book. You'll remember from earlier on, I said that these are secure facts because, well, Sanders says they're secure facts because the majority of historians that focus on this period of history are agreed this actually happened in Jesus' life. So, the historical Jesus. So, about the year 30, he went back to Jerusalem for Passover. He created a disturbance in the temple area. He had a final meal with his disciples. He was arrested and interrogated by Jewish authorities, specifically the high priest. And he was executed on the orders of the Roman prefect, Pontius Pilate. As I said, Sanders then goes on to provide a short list of equally secure facts about the aftermath of Jesus' life. The disciples first fled. They saw him, but in what sense is not certain, after his death. As a consequence, they believed that he would return to found the kingdom. And they formed a community to await his return and sought to win others to faith in him as God's Messiah. Now, I guess the purpose of the remainder of this evening is to focus on that third last bullet point. Today's historians, both Christian and non-Christian, are agreed that something happened to convince the disciples they had seen Jesus after his death. So, what did the disciples see? Well, in the rational 21st century, I guess it's difficult to get our heads around the idea of a man dying and coming back to life again 3 days later. Our medical knowledge, our understanding of biology and physics all tell us that people just don't come back to life again after they die. So we might think, surely there's some other explanation. Well, what we'll do now is look at some of the more common alternative explanations and see how they sit with the evidence we have for what happened. Okay. So one explanation could be it's pretty easy to appear to your disciples after your death if you didn't die in the first place. So was Jesus really executed? Could he have been taken down off the cross before he died and then revived later? At first glance, this doesn't look too implausible. We've all heard of people who've been pronounced dead, then to everyone's surprise, revived some hours or days later. Well, this fella here, that's Walter Williams. I can't say it. Walter Williams. He was living in Alabama, and he supposedly died in 2014. He was lying on that gurney there in the mortuary with that body bag over him, and the mortician heard a wee scratching under the body bag. He unzipped it, and there's Walter Williams recovering in hospital. So if that kind of thing can happen today, what about 2,000 years ago, when medical knowledge was more primitive and so on? Could the Romans who have executed Jesus just made a mistake? Alternatively, was the whole thing faked? Was the crucifixion somehow stage managed as some form of diversion to allow Jesus to escape? Well, in response, consider the following. Historians and archaeologists can tell us quite a lot about Roman torture and execution techniques. I won't go into the gory details here. There are plenty of books and internet sites about that very subject if you're interested. But what our knowledge of Roman torture and execution tells us is that it was very unlikely that someone survived a Roman crucifixion. Now, there are a few examples from the historical records of it happening, but it was a very, very rare occurrence. Now, even if Jesus could have been taken down before he died, and the nails taken out his wrists and feet, he'd have been unable to use his hands, and he would not have been able to walk. It's unlikely he would ever make a full recovery. Also, he wasn't executed by amateurs. Roman soldiers did the job. Now, they might not have had 21st century medical knowledge, but they knew exactly how to kill somebody. That's what they were trained to do. They were professional career killers. Also, he was executed on the orders of the Roman governor of Judea, Pontius Pilate. One argument goes that perhaps the soldiers had been bribed by persons unknown not to kill Jesus. Instead, they were to stage manage a fake execution. Well, that would have been pretty difficult because it was a public crucifixion, as all crucifixions were. That was the whole point, to act as a warning to others not to disturb the Roman order. Secondly, if that had been found out, the soldiers would have disobeyed a direct command from the Roman ruler of Judea. A slow and painful death would have been the inevitable result. Also, the sources we discussed earlier all agree that Jesus was tortured and flogged before he was crucified. So in short, just suppose he was able to survive the crucifixion. Just suppose there was some plot to get him off the cross. Well, what kind of condition would he have been in? Hardly an impressive sight to the disciples a few days later. Hardly an inspiration for the disciples then to go and spread the message of a risen Christ triumphing over death throughout the Roman Empire. So, in summary, it's highly unlikely that Jesus survived the crucifixion. It's also highly unlikely the whole thing was stage managed either. Now, if you've read the book or seen the film of Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code, you'll know that one theory is that Jesus didn't die on the cross. I'm just about to give a spoiler alert for Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code. If you haven't read it, I'm sorry, because I'm going to tell you all about it. You don't have to read it now. So what happens is, apparently Jesus escapes to southern France, along with his wife, Mary Magdalene, in southern France. Their children intermarry with the Merovingians, thus creating a holy bloodline that the Catholic Church has been trying to suppress ever since. Now, this theory is based on an earlier book by Bayesian Lee and Lincoln, The Holy Blood and the Holy Grail. It's up in the top right-hand corner of the slide. Now, we could spend some time looking at the pros and cons of this theory. However, I would be going over ground well covered on the internet, and there are numerous books and articles written on the subject currently available. Instead, what I think I can say is that this theory is just that, a theory. While there are historically factual elements about the theory, other facts are ignored. There's also a large amount of speculation required to arrive at the conclusion the books and film make. If this is an area of interest, my suggestion would be to read the reviews and articles on the subject. Simple Google search will get you going. A review of these items, I think you'll find, demonstrate why this theory really has no serious takers amongst the overwhelming majority of today's historians. Okay. So, it would look most likely that Jesus was executed. What happened to his dead body then? Now, that's important to consider. Clearly, it would be very difficult to explain Jesus being alive after his death if his corpse was still in the tomb. The gospel account is that he was executed, he was prepared for burial, he was placed in a rock cave tomb. On the third day after his death, some of his female followers went to the tomb. They found the tomb open and Jesus' body missing. As I mentioned earlier, although the documentary evidence seems to vary a wee bit in the details of the empty tomb in the Gospels, this event is present in all 4 of them. Clearly, early Christians believed that his body had disappeared from earth so they could come back alive to his followers. However, are there any other explanations why his body might have been missing? Well, perhaps the best way of approaching this is to look for a motive. Who could have removed the body from the tomb, and what would their motive be for doing so? Excuse me. Well, I guess the Romans could have. Now, the Romans' main concern was maintaining order in Jerusalem. Their motivation for executing Jesus, as we've seen, was in direct response to the disturbance Jesus had created in the temple area. This disturbance created the unrest the Romans were always seeking to avoid in this very volatile part of their empire. Now, Jesus had some very devoted followers. Perhaps the Romans were concerned that leaving Jesus' body in the tomb, it would become a shrine to Jesus and a focal point for further unrest. Excuse me, just a drink of water. Now, this line of thought does have some contemporary or modern parallels. For example, at the end of the Second World War, the Russians discovered Hitler's body in his burned-out bunker in Berlin. However, they destroyed the body so that it could not be buried. Their concern was that Hitler's grave would become a focal point for Nazi sympathisers in the future. However, what undermines that theory is that shortly after Jesus' death, Jesus' followers are going around saying he's risen from the dead. They are making a nuisance of themselves and causing the very disorder the Romans were trying to avoid in that part of their empire. Indeed, the Romans then spent about the next 300 years trying to suppress the disorder that developed throughout the Roman Empire as a result of that one event. So, to nip it all in the bud, to stop it all getting out of hand, if the Romans had taken Jesus' body, would they not have produced it? Now, as you may remember from the first half, a common fate for the corpses of crucifixion victims was they were thrown in the municipal rubbish dump outside Jerusalem, where they were eaten by wild animals and dogs. If that is what the Romans had done with Jesus' body, they might not have had it to produce. However, it would have been a relatively simple thing to publicly state this is what had happened to the body. However, we get no direct evidence or even hints of evidence that anything like that actually happened. So I think we have to conclude it's unlikely the Romans were responsible for the empty tomb. Okay, what about the Jewish authorities? Well, their rationale for perhaps taking the body and the counter-arguments are pretty much the same as the Romans. What about the disciples? Could the disciples have taken the body? What motive would they have? Again, this would look to be unlikely. I personally can't think of a motive they might have for doing this. Also, the disciples believed that Jesus was raised from the dead and were prepared to die for that belief. In most cases, they did die for that belief. If they'd taken the body, well, why then would they make up the raised from the dead story and be prepared to die in defense of it? It just doesn't really make any sense. Well, what about grave robbers? Now, to me, the idea of grave robbers stealing Jesus' body looks like more of a possibility. Grave robbing did occur at that time. Robbers were looking for the valuable goods, sometimes buried with a body. In fewer cases, they were looking for the body or body parts for use in magic rituals. Okay, was there anything to steal? Well, the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke don't mention any grave goods at all. They just mention the body was wrapped in a linen cloth. Grave robbers usually steal the goods buried with a body, not the decomposing body itself. Now, John's Gospel mentions 34 kilograms of myrrh and aloes which were wrapped tightly into the binding round Jesus' body. That would have been worth stealing. However, John's Gospel also tells us that Jesus' grave clothes were in the tomb with the burial cloth neatly folded. When the disciples entered the tomb and found Jesus' body missing, that doesn't fit with the grave robbing theory. If you were robbing a grave of spices wrapped tightly into the linen binding round a dead body, it would make sense to either pick up the body, take it somewhere else, unwrap it, and take the spices out, or to do exactly that in the tomb. In the first example, there would have been no body or grave clothes in the tomb. In the second example, there would have been a dead body and the grave clothes in the tomb. Neither situation is described in John's Gospel. So, it looks unlikely that anybody stole Jesus' body robbed Jesus' body of the grave goods that were mentioned in John's Gospel. Now, we know from a few Roman and Greek sources that dead human bodies or body parts were sometimes used for magic rituals in the Roman Empire. However, the practice wasn't rife, and we have no evidence that this occurred within the Jewish part of the Roman Empire. Indeed, Jews would find this kind of behaviour abhorrent. This burial occurred in Jerusalem, the most Jewish of Jewish towns and cities. That makes the concept of a stolen body for the purposes of magic even less likely than if the burial had occurred in, say, Rome or Athens or Alexandria or somewhere like that. So, nobody seems to have a particularly strong motive for taking the body or keeping it a secret. One final point is worth making on this subject. Now, the disciples of Jesus are the founders of what we know as Christianity. They didn't go to some place miles away from where it all happened to preach about the resurrection. No, they went back to Jerusalem and where it all happened to preach about the resurrection. So, when they went back to the very place of Jesus' execution and tomb, fundamental to their teaching was the empty tomb of Jesus. If that teaching had been false, it would have been clearly evident to some people in Jerusalem. Some people would be bound to know where Jesus' tomb was and or what happened to the body. Indeed, the tomb was owned by a prominent member of the Sanhedrin, the Jewish ruling council. That's Joseph of Arimathea. So somebody would be bound to know where it was. Also, the population of Jerusalem was about 70,000 in the first century, which it grew to about 250,000 at Passover. But it's not a big city. Word would have got round. It would have been clearly very difficult to win converts if one part of their teaching was so evidently false. So, in conclusion, I suppose I can't say that there's concrete evidence to demonstrate that Jesus' body left earth as the disciples claimed. However, I think what's clearer is that his body disappeared, and that those with a vested interest in claiming it was still on earth, that is, the Romans and the temple authorities, couldn't prove it actually was. Okay. So, was Jesus seen alive by his followers? At the start of this session, I said that there's E.P. Sanders' secure fact that Jesus' disciples saw him, but in what sense is not certain, after his death. As we saw, Sanders says that because historians are of the majority view that Jesus' disciples saw him after his death. I guess what historians are less certain about is the "in what sense" part of that statement. Okay, what do the Gospels and letters of Paul say? Well, there's more than one appearance in the Bible. There are 11 separate and distinct appearance events described. These events happen to individuals, groups of people, and in one case, 500 people. They happen over a period of 40 days after Jesus' death, with the exception of his appearance to Paul, which happened much later. The Gospels are clear that Jesus was with them physically. He could eat, drink, cook, be touched, and be conversed with. but he could disappear and appear at will. Often in the appearance events, the disciples don't seem to immediately recognize the person they're with as Jesus. Now, as I said already, in the rational 21st century, it's difficult to get our heads around the idea of a man dying and coming back to life again 3 days later. Our medical knowledge, our understanding of biology and physics, all tell us, our own personal experience, all tell us that people just don't come back to life after they die. So, are there any other possible explanations for what the disciples saw, other than the risen Christ? Well, did they see a ghost? And I think for us in the rational 21st century, that's probably about as hard to grasp as seeing the resurrected Jesus. However, the descriptions of a physical Jesus that could eat, drink, and be touched doesn't sound like a spectral appearance. Well, were they subject to some form of hysteria? Now, the followers of Jesus would have been very distraught after his death. That can make people a bit irrational and unstable. Is it possible that seeing Jesus alive again was all in their minds some sort of mass hallucination, some sort of fevered imagination, wish fulfillment? Well, in response to that, our knowledge of psychology tells us that hallucinations are individual occurrences. They aren't something that can happen to groups of people at the same time. I did a bit of research on this when I was putting these slides together. I wanted to find out why people have hallucinations, the medical reasons for that, and the kind of conditions that are common with people having hallucinations. So I typed hallucination into Google. I got a lot of interesting medical articles on hallucination, and I learned a lot. Great. Then I typed mass hallucination into Google, and I got a whole lot of conspiracy theory stuff and stuff about Atlantis and all kinds of stuff, mental stuff. I think what I'm saying is you can stick the word mass and the word hallucination together in a sentence to get the phrase mass hallucination. It can exist in a sentence, but it can't exist in real life. You can't have two people having exactly the same hallucination at the same time. It's impossible. Now, having just said all that, you could just about imagine a situation where a small group of people grieving in a room together might work themselves up into such an emotional frenzy that they were able to convince each other that they had seen the person they were grieving over. You could just about imagine that. Could any of the appearance events fit with something like that? Well, if I'm honest, the circumstances of one or two could, although if I'm also honest, there is nothing in the sources hinting that anything like that actually occurred. And for the rest of the appearance events, the actual description of the Gospels just don't fit with some kind of hysterical event. For example, two disciples are walking to a village called Emmaus in broad daylight. They are chatting when suddenly Jesus appears with them. And another, the disciples are out catching fish in the Sea of Galilee. As they come ashore, Jesus is waiting for them and has cooked breakfast for them. Another, Jesus appears to more than 500 people at the same time. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, there are 11 separate appearance events in the documentary evidence we have. When these are studied and dissected, there's little or no evidence to suggest that hysteria played a part in the appearance events described by the disciples. Okay, so, well, did the disciples make it all up? As I mentioned before, nearly all the disciples met violent deaths, proclaiming Jesus as the risen Son of God. They just wouldn't have done that if they'd made the whole thing up. So, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, today's historians, that is Christian historians and non-Christian historians, specialising in first century Near Eastern history, are of the majority view that the disciples saw Jesus after his death. Well, in what sense did they see Jesus? Well, it's unlikely they saw a ghost. It's unlikely they suffered some form of hysterical event. It's unlikely they made it all up. So, as I've said a few times, in the rational 21st century, it's difficult to get our heads around the idea of a man dying and coming back to life again 3 days later. It's pretty implausible. It just doesn't happen. But historians tell us that the disciples saw Jesus after his death. We've looked at various explanations for that. By deduction, it would seem that the least unlikely explanation is that they actually saw Jesus alive after his death. By deduction, the other explanations look even more implausible than that. Okay. So, analysis of the evidence we've looked at so far points to the resurrection being an actual historical event. However, is there any other evidence we should consider? I think that the answer is a clear yes. Consider the following. Okay, we touched on this a few minutes ago. Let's consider this in a bit more detail. Well, so what, you might say? Countless people have died for their beliefs since the disciples. Indeed, for thousands of years, people have been enthusiastically dying for what they sincerely believe in. From Emily Davison to Bobby Sands to the suicide bombers of Israel, Iraq, and Afghanistan, to the London tube bombers, to the Jews of the Spanish Inquisition. These are just a few of the countless numbers of people who have died for their sincerely held beliefs since the disciples. However, there's one key difference with the disciples. The disciples sincerely believed that Jesus had died, and they had personally met him after his death. They sincerely believed that they had personally conversed with him, eaten with him, and touched him, and were prepared to die for that belief. What they weren't prepared to die for was an ideology or set of beliefs passed on to them from some political or religious leader. Now, you could say later Christian martyrs might fit into that category. However, with Jesus' disciples, it's different. They were prepared to die and did die because they had personally seen Jesus alive after his death. This points clearly to the disciples having actually seen Jesus after his death. Okay, another circumstantial thread of evidence is the conversion of skeptics. Now, in the very early days of Christianity, two of the early leaders of the Way, as the early Christians called themselves, were people who had been unconvinced that Jesus was the Son of God. We heard earlier on about Paul. When he was called Saul, he was a persecutor of Christians. What changed him to becoming a follower of Jesus was meeting him alive on the road to Damascus sometime after his death. The other former skeptic we know of is James, the brother of Jesus. Now, Jesus wasn't an only child. He lived with a number of brothers and sisters. Indeed, his whole family, including his mother, initially tried to stop him in his mission. In Mark's gospel, his whole family, presumably James included, come to get him. Mark says, when his family heard about this, that is his teaching, they went to take charge of him, for they said, he's out of his mind. That's Mark chapter 3, verse 20. James is not mentioned as a follower of Jesus in the Gospels. Yet in the early church, James is a leading figure. Well, why the change? Well, we're told in Paul's letters that he too had seen Jesus alive after his death. James changed from being a skeptic to a believer after seeing the risen Christ. Okay, another circumstantial thread, I guess, probably the best way of thinking this is, why are there Jews today? Why do people exist today who call themselves Jews? Jews can trace their origins back to the tribal Middle East of 3,000 to 4,000 years ago. There were other people around at that time. Why are there are no people alive today who would call themselves Babylonians, Ammonites, Assyrians, Hittites, and so on? Well, the answer is in the social and religious structures that make Jews Jews. Jewish people have lived side by side with non-Jews for the last 2,000 years, but have remained distinctly different because of their own customs, laws, eating habits, religious practices, and so on. To Jewish people, these things are what make them who they are and are terribly important to them. Now, some have viewed the first Christians as just another Jewish sect. And in a sense they were. However, they were different from those other Jewish sects that existed at that time. Those other sects didn't disagree with the fundamentals of Judaism. The first Christians were all Jews. We have clear evidence that early after Jesus' death, these Jewish Christians rejected many of the foundations of Judaism. An enormous social leap, one that brought with it a great personal risk to their own lives and ostracized themselves from their communities. We've also evidence that these changes weren't made lightly or easily by the early Jewish Christians. So what were these changes? Well, they stopped offering animal sacrifice. They eventually rejected keeping Moses' laws, not the Ten Commandments, but the other eating, social, and sacrifice laws that Jews believed was the way to be right with God. They changed their Sabbath from Saturday to Sunday. They believed in a Trinity, one God in three forms. That's blasphemy to the Jews. They believed the Messiah had come. Jews were and are still waiting. And they initiated a new ritual called the Lord's Supper, a ritual that celebrates Jesus' victory over death. Well, why did the early Jewish Christians make these changes? Well, because the leaders had seen Jesus alive after his death, remembered his teachings, and were therefore compelled to make these changes. Another piece of circumstantial evidence is, well, earlier on this evening we talked about how quickly after Jesus' death Christianity caught hold and spread through the Roman world. Well, why did that happen? Why did it not disappear like other religious fads we're aware of that existed within the Roman Empire that didn't survive? Why didn't Christianity just fizzle out after a few decades? Well, the answer is the resurrection. A core of people witnessed Jesus alive after his death. The sources tell us that this core of people were transformed from illiterate fishermen, Jewish zealots, tax collectors, and other ordinary people to tireless advocates for the risen Christ. As we saw earlier, the disciples formed a community to await others to faith and sought to win others to faith in him as God's Messiah. They did all that because of the resurrection. Without the resurrection, there would have been no lasting Christianity. Frankly, without the resurrection, we wouldn't be here tonight. So, I started by making two statements. There's a historical and rational basis for Jesus being the Son of God, and there's a wealth of evidence to support that view. So to end, let's briefly review what we've covered this evening. So we stated that the Gospels and most of the letters of Paul are likely to provide an accurate account of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. We stated that the view of today's historians is that these documents have been, on the whole, accurately preserved for us, haven't been subject to accidental or deliberate modification. We reviewed other historical information that was contemporary to, but out with the Gospels. This provided information that did not contradict what was in the Gospels and letters of Paul. We presented evidence demonstrating that it was very likely that Jesus saw himself as the Son of God, and we suggested that that was very unlikely that he saw himself in that way due to some psychological condition. And we also suggested that when the sources are reviewed, there's no evidence to suggest that either Jesus deliberately misled his followers or unintentionally misled his followers. We presented evidence demonstrating it was likely that Jesus was executed and died. We presented evidence showing that it was very likely that he was buried, and shortly afterwards his tomb was found to be empty. We looked at the possible reasons for his tomb being empty. We suggested that the least unlikely explanation was that his body was no longer on earth. We looked at the historical basis for Jesus' appearances to the disciples. We found that this is regarded as a secure fact by most historians. We reviewed what it was that the disciples saw. We suggested that the least unlikely explanation was that the disciples saw, met, talked with, and ate with Jesus in bodily form after his death. Lastly, we looked at circumstantial evidence for the resurrection, and we suggested that without the resurrection, it is likely that the disciples wouldn't have died for their beliefs. Skeptics like Paul and James would not have been converted. A clear separation of Jewish Christians and Judaism would not have occurred. The early church would not have emerged and spread so quickly. Christianity would not have lasted to this day. Okay. Now, history is rarely an exact discipline. We can rarely say with absolute certainty that something happened in the past at a particular time and it happened in a particular way. Even today with mass communication, controversy can rage relating to events that happened last week or a few years ago. For example, John F. Kennedy's assassination, Princess Diana's death, the Twin Towers, and so on. And I suppose it's the same with Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. I can't say with absolute certainty that the evidence I presented this evening is 100% correct. I can't say with absolute certainty, based on this, that Jesus is the Son of God. But what I can say, I think, is that Jesus being the Son of God is the most likely explanation of the pretty extensive evidence that we have. What I can say is that looked at rationally, the alternative explanations for the evidence are simply far less likely. Now, I'm sure some of you will be agreeing with that. I'm also sure some of you will be thinking, isn't this a bit one-sided? Christian presents evidence for Christianity in church setting. Surely there's another point of view. Well, frankly, if I had been sitting where you are when I was an agnostic, that's exactly what I'd be thinking. However, my spiritual journey didn't end by reading The Case for Christ and a few Christian histories on the life of Jesus. I also trawled bookshops for books on atheism. I felt sure that I'd find some atheistic stuff that would blow all this out the water. I scoured atheist websites. I read detailed hostile reviews of The Case for Christ. I listened to and read books and articles by atheists. I still do. I read the New Testament for myself. I read biographies and critiques of Jesus by non-Christians. Frankly, I'd encourage anyone with doubts about the material presented this evening to do exactly the same. And what was the result of all that research? Well, I can summarise that by saying I was an agnostic then, and I'm a Christian now. Okay. What we haven't discussed this evening is Jesus' message and what it means. What we haven't discussed is why Jesus' message is important to you today. You may or may not be glad to know we're not going to start now. However, consider this. If Jesus is the Son of God, if Jesus is the Son of God, if Jesus is real, then his message is real too. In the last 2,000 years, countless lives have been positively transformed by Jesus' message. And don't kid yourselves. If you truly accept Jesus' message, and I'm stressing the words truly accept, and Jesus' message, it's always a positive transformation. So in conclusion, do not owe it to yourselves to weigh up the evidence and decide what you think. If you do this and decide that Jesus is real, do you not owe it to yourselves to find out what his message is and start to experience that positive transformation? Thank you. Right, I said we'd have a wee question and answer session.
There is. You can do that the traditional way, which goes a little bit like this. There is also a slightly less traditional way, which is through something called Slido. So I'm hoping that in a minute on the screen there will appear QR code. Yeah, a QR code. So you can scan that with your phone. That will take you straight to a website where you can enter your question via your phone. It'll appear on the screen. That way you can do it without raising your hand and completely anonymously. There it is. So anybody who would like to raise a hand, then just do so. Derek will address the questions. Otherwise, it will come
Anybody
up.
any questions? Oh, come on. Come on. Must be something. No? Yes. So in one, yeah, it does. It does. It certainly mentions it. It certainly mentions Jesus did exist, and there's some debate about if I think it says something. It looks like there's a bit about Jesus if he could be called a man, and there's a man called Jesus if he could be called a man, and there's some debate as to whether that bit, the bit after Jesus, was originally in Josephus's writings. But yes, it does. He does mention, but he doesn't mention anything about really Jesus at all. Well, anything that is not debated about whether it's genuine or not. So I've deliberately left it out to focus on the one I provided. That was all. Having said that, that I do talk about Josephus in the booklet. You'll be able to see that and so on. Yes.
One of the things I've always found most interesting is that the first people to get to the tomb and be witnesses were women.
Yes.
And of course, if it was all fake, there wouldn't be that, because the Jewish people didn't think women had any right to have sort of that kind of
Correct.
information.
It's very true. If you're making this up in the culture at the time, you'd have had Peter and John in the tomb finding the body and so on. You wouldn't make it up with women finding the tomb, because, as the man rightly says, women weren't even allowed to give witness statements in Jewish courts because they're apparently unreliable. So if you're making it up, you wouldn't use women as the examples. Good point. Thank you. I do mention that in the booklet, but I didn't mention that. Anyway, right. Any other questions?
There's one behind you, Derek.
Oh. I've done, well, have you, oh my gosh, so they're up there, I can see them. Have you, yeah, well, that's a good question. I have done a bit of reading into Islam, and have looked at the life of Muhammad, and also looked at whether they worship the same God as Christians. So I have done a bit of research, yes. But I think it's fair to say I've done most about Christianity, but I've looked at both sides. Yeah. Any other questions? Yes.
Can I add to what you just said? I was raised as a Hindu.
Yes.
For 21 years. The difference is no Hindu God ever claims that they are the only way.
Mm-hmm.
They are one of the ways.
Yes,
There's
indeed.
no reason to actually go in depth to find out more about them, as long as you're happy with your limited.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's... yeah, I suppose what I'm saying here is, I haven't gone into other religions to anything like the same depth. I have looked at, but but it's it'd be wrong of me to say I've done the same in-depth research, if you like. And Jesus, every religion makes exclusive claims, yeah, so. The question is, which one's right? could.
We also have the nail prints.
Indeed he did. Indeed he did. Indeed he had an evidence of the nail holes in his hands and his feet. Thank you. When in his resurrected body, but it was not as a bloody mess as he was when he was crucified. Anything else? Oh, yeah, well, there they are. You did. Why didn't you mention this, the Holy Spirit? Right. Good. That's a great question. So the reason I didn't mention the Holy Spirit was, well, I didn't do two things. I didn't mention any of the Old Testament prophecies. Yeah. I didn't mention the evidence of transformed lives. I think now I'm a Christian, that's a really big source of evidence for the reality of Jesus. People's lives actually being transformed by the result of a relationship with Jesus. And of course that's done via the Holy Spirit. But I think it's fair to say that if I just remember back when I was an agnostic, I would have said, well, that's all right for you. If that's but, it doesn't mean anything to me. And I think plenty of atheists and agnostics would say something like that as well. And I didn't mention the Old Testament prophecies, which I believe are pretty convincing. But then again, I'm a Christian now, and I'm taking the Old Testament seriously. I didn't take the Old Testament seriously when I was an agnostic. So that's why I didn't mention it. And I guess I don't think you need to, because I think there's plenty of evidence here that you can't argue with, I think. What do you think about the Turin Shroud? Well, yeah, I mean, it's... I didn't mention the Turin Shroud because there's always controversy about it. There still is controversy about it. But, they do further research and so on and so forth. Yeah, it might be. I don't see any reason why it wouldn't be Jesus' burial cloth. But I suppose it is evidence. It is something we can test out and so on. But if it's a fake, it doesn't alter this. But if it's real, it doesn't alter this. Oh, with regards to the resurrection, anyone else who came back to life? Anyone else who came back to life? Aye. Definitely. Anything else? I don't know how you can type that fast.
Some of the opinions that people have of Jesus. Argument against, it's fine to respect Jesus as a moral teacher, but really his position as the Son of God is really made up as a result of almost like the disciples wanting him to be the fulfillment of the scriptures because of the Roman occupation. So they made him more than he really claimed himself to be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, possibly. We can't get inside the disciples' heads, I suppose. And what was the first part of your question? Sorry,
I suppose the question is about what would you use as an argument that Jesus was just a moral teacher and that it's fine for him to be a teacher and that's all he was?
I don't know. When I read the Gospels, he obviously is making some moral points, and but it's hard teaching. It's certainly not the easy option. But there are great rewards, of course, for following Jesus. Undoubtedly, there are great rewards from following Jesus, and if you follow his moral teaching, as you say, it's nothing but of benefit to you as an individual. But it's hard teaching to follow some of it.
You don't get crucified for being a moral teacher.
No, you don't. You don't. Indeed. It looks like it was, it was the disturbance he created. The thing about the final week, I guess, the thing that I guess impressed me when I read the Gospels for the first time is that when you read the Gospels, you can see that Jesus is completely in control of the things that happen in the final week. You know, it's basically he's directing the traffic to make sure he's on the cross on Friday. And, you know, some people have said, you know, it's just, unfortunate circumstances, you know, and he could have walked away and so on and so forth. But he makes sure that he's on the cross on Friday. I mean, no wonder he's you know, it makes it, the Gospels are clear. You know, he's racked with foreboding about what he's going to have to do, but he does it, and he makes everybody else do his bidding. The Romans, the Greek authority, the Roman authorities, the disciples, everybody does what Jesus wants them to do. Everybody's got a part to play in getting him on the cross on Friday. Anything else? Or are you done? Wait a minute. I think there's one there. Do you think the same? You've reached the same conclusion, reliable, if you only examine the historicity. Do you think that you would reach the same conclusion on the reliability if you only examine the historicity of the Old Testament? I'm not sure what that question means. I'm sorry. I'm not kind of just.
If you excluded the Gospels.
If you excluded the Gospels, right? Okay. Yeah. I don't know if I can come to a sensible conclusion on that one. You know, we've got the Gospels, and you know the Gospels are there for a reason to tell us about Jesus. But you know, certainly the Old Testament undoubtedly points to Jesus.
It would be the full story.
Yeah, but yeah, indeed. And I suppose Jewish people would regard the passages that we regard as pointing to Jesus. They have other explanations for them. So I think they make, certainly for Christians, they make most sense pointing to Jesus. But as I say, you know, other people take a variant view on them, and I'm really not qualified to say that I don't want to go up against qualified rabbis and so on, but we've thankfully got the Gospels and we've got the evidence we have. So what do we do with it?
There are other questions there, but I'm aware that we promised folks that we'd finish at a certain point in time. So if those questions are unanswered and they're yours, can I suggest you come and grab Derek?
Yes.
And ask him those questions in person?
Right.
Can we just give Derek a big round of applause? He's always done it.
One thing you have to do, everybody gets a copy of the booklet. Now, if you're sitting there thinking, oh gosh, I wish such and such a person had been here, or my brother had been here, my dad had been here, my wife had been here, whatever, take more than one copy. Make sure you get a copy for yourself and a copy for the person you're going to give it to. So I'm going to, is there somebody can give me a hand to dish these out?
Thanks, John. You will have also seen on your chairs there's a slip of paper. So if you want to know more, you want to investigate the person of Jesus who does inspire faith, then please just make use of that. There's another event where there's a flyer for as well. And just at the exits, there's a couple of books which we'd love to give you free. You don't need to give them back. This one's called If God, Then What? Fairly obvious what that does on the title. This one's a very short one on Easter.
Okay.
Written by the guy who used to produce Zoe Ball's breakfast show. For those of you who used to listen to that, feel free to take one of those. It would be wonderful to see you on Easter Sunday if you're free as well. Thank you, Derek. Thank you guys for coming.
Okay, good.